So after the release of Ace Combat 2, Namco had a huge challenge in front of them. Now that they had made a game that completely refined the mechanics of the original, they had to come up with ways to build upon and expand the franchise going forward. So the team quickly got to work on a new title, intending to make the largest and most ambitious Ace Combat game to date. So how does Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere build upon what came previously, and how does it hold up today? Well, let's talk about it. And before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the third in a series of videos where I'm playing every Ace Combat game for the first time and reviewing them as I go along. And while you don't have to have seen the first couple videos in order to enjoy this one, you'll be missing a lot of important context about my personal journey with the series if you haven't seen them. So I'll have the full playlist linked in the description below for those of you that want to go check those out first. But with that out of the way, Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere is a combat flight simulation game developed and published by Namco for the PlayStation in 1999. And before we talk about the game proper, we need to talk about what version of the game I played. See, the international release of Ace Combat 3 is a massively downgraded experience compared to the Japanese release, with the story almost entirely cut out of it, and what little story there is that's left being changed a fair bit. So for this video, I played the Japanese release of the game using a fan translation that subtitles the entire experience in English. I'm going to be reviewing this version of the game and not the international release, as this is the original experience that the developers intended back in 1999. And speaking of the story, it's actually the main source of innovation in this game. Rather than taking the approach of the previous games, the developers decided that this time around they wanted the story to be a key part of the experience, and it's actually really good. The game takes place in the near future year of 2040 in a timeline where world governments are completely gone and large corporations have taken over as the main governing power. The player starts out as a pilot for UPO, a peacekeeping organization that ensures the corporations don't start all-out wars with one another. The story plays with a lot of classic sci-fi themes such as corporate dystopia, AI, the evolution of mankind through technology, and so much more, which certainly gives the game a very unique identity among the Ace Combat games. It even has 5 different branching paths that the player can go down, all leading to their own versions of the game's events and completely unique endings, which by the way, are also completely missing in the international releases of the game. Adding to this game's unique identity, the entire story is presented with an anime art style, even including full animation for cutscenes and messages. And it's really interesting how the story presentation of the series went from scrolling text in the first 2 games to a full-blown anime in the 3rd game. But we'll talk more about the story later in the video. For now, let's talk about the actual experience of playing the game. The first thing that I noticed is that the menus and UI of the game have been pretty massively downgraded from Ace Combat 2. Not that Ace Combat 2's menus and UI are like a work of art by any means, but they were simple and easy to understand and navigate. The best example of this in my opinion is the UI element in that game that displayed the stats of each aircraft. When you looked at it, you could see what the stat was, and the bars would give you a pretty good idea at the strengths and weaknesses of each jet. But here in Ace Combat 3, not only is this much less easy to understand than what we got in Ace Combat 2, it also displays less detailed statistics to the player, having reverted back to the stats displayed in air combat. And the mission briefings didn't fare any better. Not only do they look significantly worse, having lost the full 3D effects they had in AC2, but the functionality to pan around and see the aircraft and the skill level of each pilot is also completely absent, with all that now being replaced by simply getting the briefing and then immediately going on to select your jet. This is a huge loss in my opinion, as those unique mission briefings were one of the things early on that displayed the unique identity of Ace Combat to me. Not to mention being able to see what you are going up against and then knowing when you're in the mission whether you're up against an average pilot or an ace. It's not a huge deal that it's gone now, but I really hope that it gets brought back for the next game because I really enjoyed those briefings. Continuing with that line of thinking, the HUD for the first person mode of this game is probably the worst in the series so far. The majority of the HUD in this game is perfectly fine, but there are a couple elements here that I take issue with. I'm not sure what the technical term for it would be, but the first one is this element that displays the angle of your pitch. It has this weird effect where it's warped towards the center of the screen, which is a little disorienting when you're trying to pilot around in dogfights. But really, it's this compass they've added that throws me off the most. The entire time that you're piloting in first person, that thing is always going to be there, and a lot of the time it's going to be obscuring your sight. These elements, along with other smaller things like an arrow to display what direction your target is facing and all that, can just clutter the screen a lot of the time, and it often made it difficult to see what was going on. But once you adjust to it and you're able to see beyond the HUD, you'll realize that the graphics have once again improved over AC2. Similar to last time, there's more details in the textures, more geometry in the levels, and more polygons in the aircraft models. And as random as it might sound, my favorite part of the visual improvements here are the missile trails. The missiles looked way better in Ace Combat 2 than in Air Combat, and now they look even better here in Ace Combat 3. This game is by far the peak of the series visuals on the PS1, and it's incredibly impressive when you consider just how large the levels in this game really are and how much the system was rendering at any given time. Something else that I realized almost immediately was that the controls felt a lot worse than in AC2. For the first minute or so, I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt like such a downgrade, but then I realized. The 360-degree fine controls for the left thumbstick from AC2 are gone, and Ace Combat 3 simply uses the 4 cardinal directions. The game ends up just taking whatever direction your thumbstick is closest to, meaning that there's always a small disconnect between the direction you're pushing the stick and the direction that the game will actually input into your aircraft. On top of that, it took me a while to realize it, but Ace Combat 3 actually has proper physics for your aircraft. In the first 2 games, if you were diving downwards and then suddenly pulled up, your plane would change direction in a very arcadey, video gamey fashion. But here in AC3, if you do that same thing, your pitch will change and you'll slowly start to change direction, but you'll still have some momentum that's carrying you downwards towards the ground for a second or so until your momentum fully shifts. It's really weird to get used to coming off of the first couple games, but once you're used to it, it actually feels pretty amazing. There's something about this more kinetic feel to piloting that's just so satisfying once you adjust to it and learn to control it, and it's a huge improvement to the game feel here. And speaking of huge improvements, one of the largest gameplay refinements here comes from the release of the PlayStation's DualShock controller. Like I mentioned in the last video, Ace Combat 2 was made at a time that the dual analog controller was the newest one available, but now with Ace Combat 3, this game was developed with the brand new DualShock controller in mind. And as I also mentioned in that video, one of the largest innovations with the DualShock controller was the addition of rumble. So here in AC3, they've added a feature where when your aircraft is getting close to stalling out due to low speeds, high altitude, whatever it is, your controller will actually vibrate to simulate the feeling of the plane shaking before it stalls out and give you a warning ahead of time. So gone are the days of randomly stalling out with no prior warning like we saw in the first 2 games. Now we get a little heads up just before it happens, giving us that chance to react and learn what speeds will lead to a stall before we actually get to that point. It may sound like a super small change to some, but trust me, when you're new to these games, this is a lifesaver and easily one of the best quality of life improvements made in the series so far. And speaking of making the games much easier to get into, they've also added that little circular indicator to help you aim your machine gun fire to the third-person view now. This makes it so that newer players like myself actually stand a chance of using our machine guns without just flipping over to first-person view to do so, and it's just another massive quality of life improvement that the team made with this game. And since we're just rolling on with small improvements, let's talk a bit about those post-mission replays. These were present in Ace Combat 2, and they were perfectly fine in that game, but they've been improved a lot here in Ace Combat 3. The camera angles are so much better, and like I said earlier, the game is just much nicer to look at than the previous game was. So I found myself watching these replays much more often, and when I did watch them, I typically did for longer than I did in AC2. Part of that might also just be that I really like the look of these somewhat futuristic jets, so take that as you will, I guess. But after my first mission was complete, I tried to find the hangar to buy some new jets, and I realized that there wasn't one. At first I was confused, but I figured it must just open up at a certain point in the game, so I continued to play, but then I realized after my second mission that I wasn't getting paid any credits. And this was when it hit me that earning credits through missions to buy new aircraft was removed in favor of just earning new fighters through completing missions. And honestly, I don't think this is much of a problem. At first, I didn't like the removal of the credit system as I thought it was an unnecessary removal, but then I realized that it just makes it a lot easier for players to enjoy their time going through the campaign, as if you end up getting shot down or crashing, you just get to retry the mission with no larger repercussions. This is one of those changes that I didn't like simply because it was a change and I didn't really have any particular reasons behind it. After having finished the game, I feel like the only thing it really changes is that it isn't possible to reach a game over state and need to restart the entire campaign like you did in air combat, so ultimately, I don't have much of a problem with the change. And it also adds some personality to the branching story paths of the game. See, as you make decisions throughout the game, you might end up working for different factions throughout, and when you do, the fighters at your disposal change as well. This means that your story decisions also have a direct impact on your gameplay, not to mention how cool it is to start working for a different organization and have new planes to pilot as a result, so it only leads to me enjoying this change just that little bit more. And while we're talking about the new jets in this game, we should talk about the different equipable weapon types. When you're gearing up for a mission, certain fighters might have the option to change what machine guns or missiles they're using, and these can change the performance of your fighter pretty drastically. Instead of the standard machine gun, you might want to bring the heavier cannons along, or instead of the standard missiles, maybe you want smaller short-range missiles so you can fire bursts of 6 or so at a time as opposed to the standard 2. It's a great addition that adds just a little bit of personalization to your aircraft, but a little bit of personalization that's very much appreciated. Something else that came back from Ace Combat 2 are the landing segments after certain missions. These were still only used a couple times throughout the campaign, but there are also some very similar post-mission segments such as the mid-air refueling or the docking segments that have been added here. Much like I said before, I loved the landing segments because they added some extra personality into the gameplay loop and just lent more to that feeling of being an ace pilot, and I feel exactly the same way about these new segments that have clearly been made just to build off of that idea. And just because I haven't referenced things from the Ace Combat 2 video enough, let's talk about the wingmen a little bit. I mentioned in the last video that Ace Combat 2's wingmen felt practically useless a lot of the time, but here in Ace Combat 3, that's definitely not a problem anymore. My wingmen not only felt much more useful during missions, but they also added some indicators to the end of mission report to show where they shot down or destroyed enemies, so I can definitely confirm that they were much more useful here than before. And since the credits of previous games have been removed, your wingmen are actually just your squad mates that work with you depending on your faction in the story. Regardless of your faction, the squad mates all seem to be useful, and from what I can tell, there doesn't seem to be any sort of difference between them gameplay-wise, but it just adds even more to the branching paths of the game to have your squad mates change based on your decisions as well. And much like Ace Combat 2, Ace Combat 3 also strives to increase the mission variety. For the most part, the mission variety is about on par with that of the previous game, but there are various small additions that add that little bit of spice to keep things feeling fresh. For example, there was one mission that was a very typical go here and destroy the base mission, but the base had jammers that disrupted my missile targeting, forcing me to only use my machine guns for the duration of the attack. On top of that, there was one where there was a base spread throughout a canyon and we had to go and do some ravine runs to take it out, but instead of just having one linear ravine run this time, they actually had this large open map that you had to dip down into the ravines and fly through in order to take out some of those base pieces. So you got an equal mix of dogfighting and trench running in the same mission. There weren't really any new mission types, at least not that I experienced in my playthrough, but little variations like this can make similar missions feel entirely new, so I hope to see more stuff like this from the series going forward. There were, however, some missions that I expected to feel really unique that ended up falling short. The biggest example of this was one mission where during the brief, I was told that they would be launching me into low orbit in a special aircraft made just to hit enemies with an aerial strike that they would never see coming. So I get into this jet that was tailor-made for this one mission, get launched up into orbit, and then the mission is just a standard dogfight. I was fully expecting this to be some sort of like high-speed strafe run where I flew straight down on top of them, but no, it ended up just playing exactly like any other mission would. I bring this up simply to point out that while in some places mission variety has improved, in others it still has a lot of room to grow, so I'm still very much hoping to see some sort of expansion from this. But with most of my gameplay thoughts out of the way, let's finally talk about the story. Like I've mentioned a couple times, there are 5 different paths that the story can go down during this game, and all of them offer a totally unique experience to one another. During my first playthrough, I didn't use a guide to ensure that I went down a specific path. I just made decisions as I wanted to see where I would end up by doing so, and oh boy, was that a journey. So like I mentioned near the beginning, you'll spend the first act of every playthrough working for UPO, the peacekeeping organization of AC3's world. And this allows the player to get acclimated to the game while learning about the world and the other factions within it. A few missions in, we ran a joint operation with the General Resource Corporation, and I had the opportunity during this mission to fly alongside their ace pilot, Abyssal Dissian. At the end of the mission, Dissian tells me that he thinks my skills are wasted working for UPO, and that if I wanted to make a real difference in the world, I should go work for him at General Resource. And as much as I had already started to get attached to my squad mates at UPO, I decided to go with Dissian as it sounded like the more interesting path to take. While working for General Resource, my squad was made up of myself, Dissian, and another high-ranking pilot named Keith. Keith and Dissian had been working together for a very long time, so Keith was hesitant to trust me at first, but there were numerous times where Dissian would be unavailable for a mission, leaving me and Keith to take them on as partners, and slowly through these missions he would grow more and more fond of me. Then, near the end of the second act, Dissian takes a paid leave for a while, something Keith mentions as being incredibly uncharacteristic of him, and this all leads up to the biggest plot twist in the game. At the beginning of the third act, it is revealed that throughout the entirety of the story, Dissian hadn't actually been physically present for any of it, as his consciousness had been sublimated into a computer software before being uploaded into a new cyberspace known as the Electrosphere.
He said it! He said it!
Dissian's goal is to create a new society in which everyone was sublimated and uploaded to this network, allowing humanity to shed their physical bodies and move on to the next frontier. So, Dissian creates a terrorist organization known as Ouroboros, and it is revealed that he already has ace pilots from every organization and faction allied with him. This reveal coincides with an offer for you to join Ouroboros, so once again, I decided to follow Dissian and see where this route would take me. Things went well for us for a while, but over time, more and more of our pilots started to fall, and eventually, Keith even shows up, sent in by General Resource to take us down. So here, I decide to side with Keith, turning against the Ouroboros pilots for one final dogfight. In this fight, Keith sacrifices himself to take out the last pilot Dissian had on his side, and then it's just the two of us left. So I start dogfighting with Dissian, and eventually this leads to us actually slipping into the Electrosphere itself for one final battle, in which I managed to wipe Dissian from the network for good. And that's the ending of the game. No one survives aside from the player character, and the world is left to slowly rebuild itself after the damage that Dissian caused. And keep in mind that this is a very heavily abridged telling of the story. There's a lot of depth and detail to it that I completely skipped over just for the sake of time. And keep in mind that if you haven't played the game for yourself, it's more than likely that when you do, things will go down an entirely different route than they did for me. And a lot of people have been asking me to talk in more detail about the music, so here's a little section that I'm adding in near the end of editing just to make sure that I don't miss this opportunity. In my opinion, Ace Combat 3 has the least memorable soundtrack of the series so far. That's not to say that it's bad, but instead of using that over-the-top rock style that just demands your attention like the first two games did, they opted for a more sci-fi sounding track that kind of just meanders in the background. If you ever take a second to stop and pay attention to the music in this game, it's actually pretty damn good, but it's one of those soundtracks that just kind of blends in to the point where you don't notice it for the majority of the game. So like I said, not a bad soundtrack on its own merit, but definitely the weakest of the three so far. But overall, Ace Combat 3 makes a lot of improvements over Ace Combat 2, and it's definitely the most ambitious game in the series, but some of the very core components feel downgraded. There's so much to love here, from the story paths to the mission variety and the unique identity of a near-future Ace Combat game. But at the same time, things like the controls and the UI have been so downgraded compared to AC2 that it makes it hard to call this the best game in the franchise so far. That being said, for some people, this will definitely be their favorite of the PS1 trilogy, but for those of you that are more gameplay focused like I tend to be, it probably won't take the second game's spot for you. And of course, before we wrap up, a huge shout out to the team that put together this fan translation. They did a fantastic job, and once you get through the initial process of figuring out how to mod a PS1 game, it makes it so easy for new players and veterans alike to enjoy this game as it was always meant to be, rather than make do with the butchered international releases. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Ace Combat 3 Electrosphere a 7.5. But what do you guys think? Those of you that have played the game, those of you learning about it for the first time through this video, let me know in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a like, a comment, a subscription, anything to let me and the algorithm know that you did enjoy. It helps me out a lot, so I'd really appreciate it. And if you're interested in supporting the channel financially, consider checking out becoming a channel member or a patron. They start as low as $1 a month and can get you things like behind the scenes updates, early video access, and more. But if you can't afford to, don't worry about it. We've all been there, and your likes, comments, etc. already help out the videos plenty. And hey, if you enjoyed this video and you haven't seen them already, then you definitely enjoy the rest of my Ace Combat videos, or maybe even another series that we recently started doing the exact same thing for the Metal Gear franchise. So if you want to check either of those out, I'll have them both linked right here on screen.